In this video, I want to share with you a single sentence that, in my opinion, is the most thought-provoking response to the question, are Jews the chosen people? So just let me read it to you. From every point of view, it looks as if the Jewish people were the chosen people, at least in the sense that the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem, insofar as it is a social or political problem. Now, you may need to watch that again, listen to that again. Okay, let me read it for you one more time. Dial in, okay? Focus. Listen to this and don't judge yet. From every point of view, it looks as if the Jewish people were the chosen people, at least in the sense that the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem, insofar as it is a social or political problem. Now, that is a brilliantly thought-provoking answer to the question, are the Jews the chosen people? Now, many people, some of you watching this, no doubt, will not like the notion of the Jews as a chosen people. Some of you might, depends on where you, how you identify, where you fall on these things. But let's say many people I know, because I encounter them online, have a great deal of hostility to the notion of the chosenness of the Jews. It's a very difficult topic. It might seem like it's just ethnocentrism or chauvinism or racism or Jewish supremacism, as some people say. And let's set all of that to the side. Okay, let's set to the side the interpretation of Jewish chosenness as an ontological selection by God that places the Jewish people in their peoplehood over and above all others by virtue of their essential nature. Okay, so we're setting that aside. There are some Jews who think that. There are some Jews who defend that view. And I'm just going to set that aside for a moment because I want to focus on this sentence, that the chosenness of the Jews consists in the fact that they're the most manifest symbol of the human problem to the extent to which it is a social or political problem. What might that mean? And why is that worth thinking about? So first, I guess I should tell you why I decided to quickly make this video in the first place. And it's that, there are certain people online call themselves Groypers, followers of Nick Fuentes. I'll be honest with you, okay? It's not like I watch his show, don't really know the details, but they come up from time to time when I say something about the person who wrote that sentence, Leo Strauss. Now, I'm an unabashed promoter of Leo Strauss as the gold standard scholar of the history of political philosophy in the 20th century. In my opinion, okay? In my opinion, if you're trying to learn about political philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, first and foremost, but not only, also the various phases in that history from the pre-modern to the modern, to the postmodern even, if you're thinking about Machiavelli, Nietzsche, and many figures, some of whom are Jewish, with asterisks, because there's a bit of a debate as to how Jewish they are. By that I mean, for example, there's Judah Halevi, Maimonides, two people who would normally be taken as Jewish, self-evidently so, and Spinoza, who was excommunicated from the Jewish community, so you may think that he's not best understood as a Jewish person. But Strauss also wrote about many medieval Islamic figures like Al-Farabi, for example. Obviously, and most importantly, in my opinion, he wrote about the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes, the comic poet. Okay, some of those books that I'm mentioning I have on the shelf behind me here. And so, to my mind, it is not first and foremost as a promoter of Judaism that Leo Strauss is to be read. Rather, it's as a brilliant expositor, interpreter, commentator, reader, and teacher. And I guess if you're thoughtful, then that should be something that's important to you. Now, I don't claim that he's the only one, and I don't claim that the only good teachers are Jewish, okay? It just so happens that for me, Strauss is the best, really, guide. And therefore, I recommend him to people. However, when I do so, from time to time, I'll get the kind of response that says, Leo Strauss, are you kidding me? That guy was a rabid Zionist and a Jewish supremacist, and nobody should read anything he says unless you're reading it as evidence of his subversive Jewish plot to infiltrate the American Academy and turn Jews from communists into something else, and yada, 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 yada. Okay, so Strauss is primarily interpreted as a nefarious source of Jewish influence. And therefore, anybody who recommends the reading or the study of Strauss, like myself, is also taken to be part of this nefarious Jewish influence. Okay, fine. So let's try to do something about this picture. Okay, like I said, there are many, many, many opportunities here, but brilliantly, we have Strauss in this sentence saying something about the question of Jewish chosenness that I think allows the thoughtful among us, and I know that there are, all across the political spectrum. I know that there are thoughtless Jews and thoughtful anti-Semites, okay, and every permutation you can imagine. But I think that Strauss appeals to the thoughtless among us. Among us means among those who care at all about these questions in any way. He says Jews are chosen to the extent to which, okay, the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem. It's a symbol. It's the most manifest symbol of a problem. It's the most manifest symbol of a problem that is not unique to the Jews in this formulation, okay? It's the most manifest, the easiest to see, the most conspicuous, the most obvious and self-evident symbol for a human problem, a problem that applies to everybody, provided you are human, to the extent to which it is a social or political problem. Now, as I say, that's one sentence that packs in a lot of information. So there is a social and political problem that is part and parcel of the human problem, but which the Jewish, how could you put it? The Jewish problem, if you prefer, the Jewish question formulated in a certain way, or the phenomenon of Jews and Judaism, is the manifest symbol of that human problem in its social and political dimension. So what is Strauss talking about, and why is this important to see? Well, first of all, I don't think you could argue too much. I mean, fine, you could always argue with anything. But I take it as relatively reasonably acceptable to say that the Jews are, in one way or another, a manifest symbol of something, right? In other words, given their proportion in the population, whether for better or for worse. Now, I'm not going to say everybody has something to say about the Jews. I'm sure there are a lot of people who just don't care, would prefer not to care, wished that the topic of the Jews and Israel never came up, and so on and so on and so on. But nevertheless, it's conspicuously the case that Jews occupy a lot of attention, for better or for worse, as I say, right? Maybe you think, oh, look, they've been kicked out of all of these countries. That proves how horrible they are. Or maybe you say, look, the percentage of Nobel Prize winners, that proves how brilliant they are. Or everything in between and everything on the extremes. So Jews are a manifest symbol of the human problem to the extent to which it's a social or political problem. What did Strauss mean with this? Well, here's I think the real portal somehow in which, regardless of how you feel about Jews and Judaism, you could treat the subject matter as a way to get into, you don't have to, but you could, and I think it's valuable to do, as a way to get into what is the social and political dimension of the human problem. Let me again just read you the exact words here, right? So the most manifest symbol of the human problem, insofar as it is a social or political problem. The human problem. What's the human problem in its social or political dimension? Well, that's the kind of question that, again, in my opinion, I think that you read Plato's Republic, and Plato's Republic is a book that deals from the first page to the last page with the human problem to the extent to which it's a social or political problem. As, for example, does Plato's Laws. As, for example, does Aristotle's Politics. Now, are Aristotle and Plato rabid Zionists and Jewish supremacists? Come on now, let's be serious. So why does reflection on the Jews, from Strauss's point of view, why is it a symbol of this more serious problem? Well, look, what are some aspects of this human problem in its social and political dimension? Well, for example, how do we draw a line around what we consider our own? What we consider ours and what we consider foreign. Okay, needless to say, in what I just said, there's a huge element of the political dimension of the human problem built in. Who are ours? Nashi. Who are our people? What does it mean to be one of us? Where is that bound or boundary of the usness of a group. This is discussed in Plato's Republic, okay? Not because he was doing Jewish apologetics, but because it belongs to the nature of political life to have to deal with this issue. On one hand, it seems like there's something natural to groupings. Family grouping seems to be natural. On the other hand, there seems to be an element of convention in political groupings. Yes, some naturalness, but also some convention. There's such a thing as a naturalized citizen. And why do we draw the border here and not there? And where exactly do we put the criterion for who's in and who's out? Fine, even if you go all the way down to the super duper genetic level, the question is, are the political groupings, is the political community, is the polis through and through natural? Or does it have some dimension of the conventional? What's the relationship? What's the proportion? How do we think about that? So in Plato, that is a question of great importance and great significance because it belongs to the nature of political life. And it may be that the problem persists, even though the solutions, there may be n amount of solutions that all prove inadequate. And at the end of the day, the last man standing is just the problem. There's no guarantee that the problems of political life have a mathematical solution. In Plato's Republic, for instance, you could say there's an attempt to mathematize or to technicize, to organize, arrange, and control and predict the political problem. But nevertheless, something escapes from control. Nevertheless, something can't be covered up with a lid. The monster has a life of its own in some sense. So the political problem, understanding politics, understanding the human problem to the extent to which it's a social or political problem, may require understanding that there is no easy solution. In fact, there is no simply stated solution, that there's this many opportunities. So you can imagine ethnic homogeneity. That's one view, right? But imagine as ethnically homogenous a grouping as you can imagine. And you might think, okay, look, we're going to have a political community for our as ethnically homogenous group as is, that's it. We're just going to limit it. That's going to be our political community. Okay, great, no problem. Now you do know, I'm sure, right? If you've read 5 to 10 pages of Plato's Republic, you do know that a political community needs to be able to defend itself because it doesn't exist all by itself. And it doesn't exist in a land of unicorns and, rainbows. It exists in a world of hostility and enmity and scarcity and competition and so on. So if you have this tiny little, extremely ethnically homogenous political entity, and you're facing this empire that feels like it can just, roll you over, what do you do about that? I'm not saying, maybe you have an answer for that. Well, okay, then you just have to have the right kind of military technology. This is why Socratic conversation is, And as you move through it, well, wouldn't you say this? Yeah, but what about this? Okay, but what about this? But what about this? And the more you think about the basic problems of political life, the more you see the great difficulty. Okay, fine. What if we don't want little ethnically homogenous political entities because they're not going to be able to compete against empires? Maybe we'll go all the opposite. We'll go to the opposite extreme. We want a global empire. We want one world or something like that. We don't even want there to be war, so we don't want there to be groupings. Okay, I'm sorry to say, but this kind of problem comes with its own difficulties. Okay, so we all have some degree, and you know this whether you're interested in the Jews or not, whether you've read Plato or not, because you can read, like I've recently been reading historical fiction about the Spanish Civil War. Very nice book. Okay, for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing. The Cypresses Believe in God. That's volume 1. 1 Million Dead. That's volume 2. There's a volume 3, I think, but I haven't read it yet. And you see, this person feels Catalonian. This person, no matter what, is going to be Basque. And so this connection that we have with our own, it makes it difficult for us to have a universal fidelity and empathy and identity. There's a new show out on Apple TV, okay? Spoiler alert. Let me just say 1 or 2 things about it here. It's called Pluribus. It deals in dramatic form with this problem, the problem of community and individuality. Nothing to do with the Jews specifically, okay? Just like Plato's got nothing to do with the Jews specifically. The problem is that the Jewish people are chosen in the sense that, in this sentence, right? They're the most manifest symbol of this problem. Okay, why again? Well, look, you have the problem of what makes us a community. By the way, or if you don't know, I'm going to tell you. there's all kinds of ways of answering this, right? We have a shared origin, or maybe we have belief in a shared origin, or maybe we have some sort of other kinds of criteria. There's a matrilineal descent, or in other cases, patrilineal descent, or who cares about your descent as long as you pledge allegiance to the whatever it happens to be, right? To the code of religious law, to the commandments, or you swear that, you have given your faith to a certain whatever it is, right? So what is it by virtue of which you're part of this group or that group? And how does that get politicized or depoliticized? And how do you deal with in the Jewish case here, a code of law? The Torah is a code of law, but it's more than that. It's law plus commentary on law, plus stories, plus the record of rabbinic disputes. And it can seem so particularistic, right? And this is not me telling you that it's not particularistic. This is me telling you that there's something to Strauss's view that every political community deals with some version of the problems that are magnified in the case of the Jews. Yeah. So that's, a pretty thought-provoking perspective. I have to tell you, not that there's any surprise here, you probably understand. If I say Leo Strauss is such a fantastic teacher, by the way, he did write about, how can you put this? He did write about Jewish topics. He wrote about Jewish thinkers. He wrote about, like I said, Spinoza, Maimonides, and others, Hermann Cohen, for instance. But he didn't write about them, to my mind, okay, why it could be profitable for anybody to read Strauss. And by the way, if there are other teachers who get you into Plato and Aristotle, thank God for that. That's fine, okay? I recommend him not primarily because he's Jewish, but primarily because he's an outstanding teacher. But again, you look at these questions. So I'll tell you, the first time that I myself became interested in Leo Strauss, it had to do with a puzzle that cuts across the faiths. Yes, it touches the Jewish faith, but that's because it cuts across the faiths. It means it's of relevance to Christians, it's of relevance to Muslims, and it's of relevance to other people who find themselves caught up in the problem that Strauss put his finger on, which was this. Strauss was interested in reason and revelation. And in a nutshell, you could say that modernity is characterized by the view that revelation ceases to be relevant or dominant or authoritative, and reason in the form of a certain sort of scientific rationality wins the day. So if you have opinions or beliefs or ways of life that are associated with revealed religion, you are regarded as superstitious or prejudiced or backwards. And if you have scientific knowledge or aspire to it, and in particular, if you're seeking to replace prejudice and backwardness and superstition and the darkness of a medieval mind with scientific rationality, you're golden. And what Strauss showed as he studied thinkers on either side of that line, the ones who broke with what we now call pre-modern to establish the modern, and he did so without automatically assuming that the moderns were right. And he says that he wanted to, and in some sense he did, reawaken a prejudice in favor of the pre-modern by showing that the possibility of revelation had never been adequately refuted in the way that it would have to be if scientific rationality were indeed to carry the day. In other words, you could say that Strauss, with great intellectual, scholarly, not only academic, but to my mind, even more fundamentally here, existential, in the sense that he wasn't just a scribbler. He had, I think, his heart and soul at stake here. He put his heart and soul at stake. He showed to those people who care about this sort of thing and who think about this sort of thing that modernity and scientific rationalism and the Enlightenment, that they didn't have the last word, that in fact, their claims don't measure up, and that the whole world that therefore they sought to replace and that they sought to destroy through propaganda actually is still there for assessing, and not only for assessing, but even for adopting, I guess, or for, relating to in this fundamental way. So for believing Christians, those who are interested in this kind of thing, he opened the door to faithful Christianity. And he wrote similarly, as I say, about the Islamic figures and about the Jewish figures. So there are all kinds of non-Jews who are indebted to Strauss for reopening the possibility that revealed religion can still be an authority for us in our lives. Now, it's also true, and it's even more true, I think, that Strauss wanted not only to carve out some space for and reestablish the legitimate claims of revealed religion against, or at least as an alternative to, the scientific rationality of modernity. It is also, and as I say, I think even more so, the case that Strauss wanted us to recover a way of life and a model of the world, as it were, and a way of being in the world that is neither first and foremost modern scientific enlightenment rationality, nor first and foremost pre-modern revealed religion. Okay, I have to emphasize the first and foremost because he did not share the Enlightenment skepticism about the worth, let's say, of the religious traditions, but he wanted to identify, and he wanted to do this because it was there to see the possibility of a way of life that is good, decent, wise, just, pious. It's intelligent without being impious, and it's pious without being unintelligent. And it is really characterized by and instantiated in the life of Socrates. So Socrates, not a modern, Enlightenment sort of skeptic. He represents something different. It's also not just, you're not going to say Socrates is a, Jewish supremacist or an Islamic zealot or something like that. It's true that Nietzsche had thoughts about the relationship of Plato to Christianity, encapsulated in this memorable phrase that Christianity is Platonism for the people. And there are all kinds of puzzles about the relationship of Plato to Socrates. But Strauss, in a word, seems to have cared most deeply about the possibility that a well-lived life of the Socratic sort, a life that does not fundamentally do harm to the things that are good, but that is oriented towards the quest for knowledge concerning important things that we recognize we don't know, together with other people who are similarly oriented. Socrates is no schmuck, and the life of Socrates is no joke. And Strauss seems to think that the recovery of the life of Socrates gives us a model that's, as I say, neither fully modern nor fully pre-modern in the sense of, you may think that if you reject modern rationalism, therefore you reject reason altogether, and that you must be in the world saturated by myth and the gods and religiosity, but at the expense of reason and intelligence. And that's not quite right. So, when Strauss says that the Jewish problem is Jews are the chosen people to the extent to which the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem in its social and political dimensions, he's dealing with all of these things that I just said. A political community, a good life seems to require a political community of some sort. Like, no man is an island, nobody's fully self-sufficient, and politics matters. Whether you think that the leader of your country is a commie or a fascist, whether you think that he's too racist or not racist enough, whatever you happen to think about him, surely you can acknowledge that the politics matters to your life, even if you don't care about it, right? If tomorrow the taxes get jacked this much, or if some other group takes power and they go around, hunting this or hunting that. And again, factor out if you prefer. If you don't want this to be in any way Jew-centric, factor out the Jews, and you just know, look, Athens went through democracy, went through tyranny, went through restoration of the democracy. You have regimes and changes of regimes, and they affect human life in a fundamental way. So that it seems to be extremely important for there to be sound political order. That seems to be related to law. And therefore, religions that are revelations of law are conspicuously interesting. Judaism is a revealed religion of law, as is Islam a revealed religion of law. So you have the whole problem of law, the interpretation of law, the nature of a revealed law, the position of the prophet, what is prophecy? All of these questions emerge and arise, weirdly, maybe not, in Plato. It's not exactly the same, obviously, but the medieval Islamic and Jewish thinkers, they had to have recourse from time to time to Plato and Aristotle in order to elaborate, understand, articulate, and think through the political questions. And as I said, because we also are dealing not just with the nature of the political community, but also with the possibility of a specific way of life, meaning Socrates, or the life of the philosopher, you also have the whole layer of puzzles concerning the relationship of the philosopher to the political community. Because famously, if you don't know, breaking news, Socrates was accused, found guilty, and killed by the city of Athens for not believing in the gods of the city, corrupting the youth, and introducing new gods. So the regime, its laws, the best way of life. What do you do if you want to be a philosophical type person within a regime that has a very strong orthodoxy? By the way, this doesn't mean that it has to be a religious orthodoxy, or to put it differently, it acknowledges that secularism can be its own sort of religion. So liberal democracy may have a certain sort of orthodoxy that when you begin to philosophize, punishes you, just like communism has a certain sort of orthodoxy that when you begin to philosophize, punishes you. This may be true of all political regimes. That's not to say they're all equally repressive, but it is to say that there may always be a natural tension between one and the other. So Strauss, among other things, seems to have thought that as you read sources, for instance, within the Jewish tradition, like Maimonides, a figure I talk about often, even though, like I said, I know Groypers don't like him because somewhere he said something about Christians, okay? Nowhere does he say in the Guide of the Perplexed, which is the most philosophically relevant work, in my opinion, to this conversation. It doesn't say anything like that. But even if he did, right, you'd have the Jewish community, the Christian community, various kinds of community here, right, but different faiths. And you'd have a person who, on one hand, is trying to philosophize, means wants to know intelligently the nature of human existence, right? What is anything? Are miracles possible, right? What is a miracle? What's the natural order? Can it always be suspended? Can there be miracles concerning human beings? What's the nature of that, right? What is all of these basic questions that are both philosophical and that bear on theology and religion? I mean, he wants to ask those questions while preserving and not undermining, can you blame him for this? Preserving and not undermining the Jewish community, right? So there's like a dual responsibility. You have a certain responsibility as a statesman, legislator, rabbi, leader, commentator, teacher, figure, public person, and you have a certain sort of responsibility or fidelity to the inquiry, to the questions, to following them where they lead, to wanting to know. And there may be, a very famous title of one of Strauss's books, The City and Man, points to the difficulty here that it may be that only a single person can know, but that when it comes to educating a large group of people, that education is always only an approximation through, let's say, in the best case scenario, true opinion. Even if everybody had an opinion that was true, they had the right opinion, they may not know, they may not have the knowledge to articulate in words with arguments why they opine what they opine. But the law has been successful if it inculcates a correct opinion. This is a very basic problem. Again, it's magnified in the case of the Jewish community, but it's not only for the Jewish community. It's a human problem to the extent to which we're treating humanity in its social and political dimension. So I wanted to make this again because lately on Twitter or X, I've been posting some things about Strauss. Then some followers, as I say, of that particular group have been saying, don't read Strauss. He's a Jewish supremacist and rabid Zionist. No, he's a thoughtful person. He's a thinker. He's a thinker. So even his early writings, somewhere here behind me, his early writings, yes, he was a member of certain Zionist student groups, but as he thought about them, he thought through the problem inherent to each of them and really was not left satisfied by any of them. And what he says about Zionism, for example, in his preface to his Spinoza book is very interesting. He says, political Zionism was originally an attempt to solve the Jewish problem in a merely political way, but then that would make, Israel a country just like any other, which sort of doesn't match this important element of Jewish tradition and belief that it shouldn't just be a country like any other, right? It's a country and a people and a tradition constituted by the Torah, right? Constituted by the Hebrew Bible and the tradition of commentary and learning and holidays around that. So therefore, you can't just have political Zionism. You have to have quote unquote cultural Zionism, where the elements of quote unquote Jewish culture factor into the statehood. Okay, so symbols and this, that, and how you're going to name it and how you're going to design it, how you're going to draw it, and the whole cultural question. But then he says very interestingly that To interpret Judaism as a culture is to deprive it of its own highest proper self-understanding, because culture means, in the common usage of the time, everything made by the mind of man. In other words, culture is the realm of human invention, human creativity. Whereas for religious Jews, the Torah is given from heaven. It's not made by the human mind. It's not like a cultural product of cultural creativity. No, it's revealed. And so cultural Zionism transforms into religious Zionism. But according to religious Zionism, according to a traditionally religious interpretation of the major sources and questions here, you really should not have a, let's say, regathering of the Jewish people short of the coming of the Messiah. So you get a full circle, so to speak, right? You have a Jewish problem. Jewish problem requires a political solution. The political solution doesn't solve it because of the cultural dimension. The cultural dimension doesn't solve it because culture contradicts the religious dimension, but the religious dimension sort of undermines the political one. And so once again, you have a fundamental problem. And to repeat, Strauss seems to think, and I would say the easiest way of understanding this is to see if you can learn something about the Jewish tradition by reading Plato, then probably that shows you that there's something intrinsic to the political problem as such, which was articulated by Plato and which we see manifested. And by the way, I happen to be teaching Plato right now. I got students from all over the world, okay? Brazil, Argentina, Israel, India, and so on, okay? Canada goes without saying, United States goes without saying. Always when people read Plato, wherever they are, they find something to relate to their political situation, okay? Because Plato speaks to the nature of political life. But again, Strauss's point is that somehow the Jews are the most manifest symbol of this problem. So if you're somebody who cares about the social and political questions and problems as they apply to humans as such, and you have some, nevertheless, hostility towards Jews for one reason or another, okay, I'll let that be your own problem, so to speak. Don't let that get in the way, if I can do this sort of public service announcement, don't let that get in the way of studying the foundations of political philosophy. If you want to skip Strauss because he's Jewish, fine. Find some other commentator. But it's extremely valuable, humanizing, insightful, edifying, ennobling, dignifying, okay, what can I tell you, and pleasant to read and to understand however much you can Plato and Aristotle. And my opinion is that Strauss is a great source for doing that. And his little statement about Jews as the chosen people from the point of view that they encapsulate this human problem, I think is just evidence not only of his brilliance, but it also just gives us something to think about. Okay, so thank you for watching. Take care. See you next time.